Hello and welcome back to Through the Trapdoor. I'm Emily.
And I'm Katie.
And this is our podcast where we read you Harry Potter fanfiction.
This time without baby noises in the beginning. I don't know about the rest.
Yeah, there might be baby noises later. We'll see. So let's continue with Chapter 13, Holding On.
Part 2.
Molly had not expected to get her wish so quickly. Even if she had, she would not have expected to receive it under such awkward circumstances. These were not the conditions under which she had hoped to fly to London. The sky outside Molly's tiny airplane window was dark, and most of the other passengers were sleeping. Molly could not sleep tonight. Normally, she was brilliant at sleeping. On airplanes, she slept even when the hardiest travelers couldn't handle it. Had she really wanted to, Molly supposed she could have coaxed her body into sleep. But her mind had another agenda. She kept replaying the conversation she'd had with her mother over the phone. It had been just after work, and Molly had just stepped inside her family's apartment when the phone started to ring. Hello? Molly, where were you? I've called 10 times already, and you haven't picked up. I was at the boutique. But Molly, it's nearly... Oh, never mind. I'm horrible with time changes. Anyway, listen. You have to start packing. You have to meet us in London. Wait, what? Why? Oh, Molly, it's just awful. You remember your cousin Lily, don't you? Yeah. She lost her father and 2 of her younger siblings, your cousins, of course. But they were so young you wouldn't have known them. But, Molly, it's so sad. You just have to come right away. Your father booked you a ticket for JFK. We'll meet you at the airport in London, all right, sweetie? Sure, she replied. Several hours later, here she was contemplating the dark sky and waiting for sunrise. What was she supposed to say to her cousin? Were there even words for this kind of occasion? Molly hated going through the thought of telling Lily that she was sorry. Of course she was sympathetic, but saying she was sorry wasn't going to make anything better. Melody stared at Mrs. Potter in disbelief as she turned and left the room. As soon as she was gone, James, Sirius, and Melody all turned their stunned gazes on Lily, who was staring blankly across the room, looking floored. What a way to spring it on the poor girl, right after telling her that she had to move out of her house. Not that Lily really seemed to mind that idea, but still. Melody strongly suspected that Lily had forgotten about the funeral, or perhaps it had never occurred to her that there would be a funeral. Furthermore, even if she thought about it, Melody suspected that Lily would have assumed it was all over and done with already, as Muggles rarely waited more than a week to bury their dead. I don't have anything to wear, Lily whispered. Melody grabbed her hand and squeezed. We'll find you something, she promised. Her Hogwarts trunk is sitting right there, James pointed out. She has black dress robes. James, this is a Muggle funeral, Melody reminded him. Oh, right. Pardon me, Lily said quickly, her voice even, but as she stood they could all see the tears in her eyes, and she left the room. James attempted to stand and follow, but Melody and Sirius pulled him back. If she left, I think she needs to be alone, Melody pointed out. Yes, but you can be comforting and overprotective later, James. I'm not overprotective. Oh, please, James, you're practically... Melody, why are you here? Sirius burst out suddenly, and Melody stared at him blinking. Pardon me? Why aren't you with your uncle in America? I was, Melody replied. But then I came here when I found out about Lily's family. Just like that? No important parties to go to? No pressing social engagements? Melody stared at him, shocked. Sirius, there are things that are more important to me than silly parties. Sirius grumbled something, and Melody looked at him, eyebrows raised. James rolled his eyes, got up, and left. Why are you being so obtuse about all this? Because, Sirius spat, you leave without saying goodbye, run around at these parties with all these, boys, and you don't owl or anything until practically Lily's whole family dies, and then we get the whole bloody package of you, broomstick and all. It's like we don't even exist half the time for you, and then all of a sudden we're the most important things in your life, or Lily is anyway. She is my best friend, Sirius, Melody reminded him. Yes, well, what am I, chopped bloody liver? Sirius yelled. You? You want to know what you are? Melody demanded, and Sirius nodded. You are the boy who broods in the corner, waiting for me to come to my senses and change back into who I used to be because you have this insane complex where you think you know everything about everyone just because you spend hours alone thinking about everything to death. Well, you know what, Sirius Black? I like who I am, and I like who I've become, and I like living my life outside of England. Thank you very much. And if that means separating myself from my friends for a few months, then so be it. I'm not entirely sure I know what your problem is, but I am certainly not going to change anything because you have a broomstick shoved up your arse about it. Sirius paled. Melody, Melody crossed her arms and stared at him, glad to have gotten the upper hand for once. I missed you, Melody, all right? Sirius said finally. You don't have to attack me. You attacked first. That's what I mean. Sorry, Melody said softly, meeting his gaze. This was always dangerous, as it always confused her. There were so many things in Sirius's chocolate-brown eyes that she could latch onto, so many brilliant ideas and beautiful words and lovely promises. There were so many things in his eyes that made her want to be with him that she always wondered why she wasn't. Except this time, an image of Paolo's brown eyes jumped into Melody's head, and that was different. I probably won't be traveling with my uncle anymore. Anyway, Melody said, taking her eyes away from Sirius's. But why? It's kind of a long story. So what? Just tell it. I had some problems getting here, that's all. Melody, Sirius said, imploringly. All right, she conceded, and launched into an explanation of her uncle's erratic, controlling behavior, and Sirius listened with narrowed eyes. I knew I never liked him, Sirius said darkly when she finished. Sirius, that's not fair. He's a good person. A good person? Are you listening to yourself? He locked you in your bloody bedroom. Yeah, he did, Melody agreed, her lips tight. And that's why I don't plan on traveling with him again, but I still think he's a good person. There are a few things I don't understand about him. He never does anything without a reason. Sirius, I don't understand why he did what he did to me, that's all. Hans Codwell didn't have time to play games. That was exactly what his niece was doing to him, too. Playing some kind of silly game, running out on him like that. She damn well knew he'd be furious when she left, and he didn't know what she was thinking disobeying a direct order. Not for the first time this summer, he'd wish he'd told her why he really wanted her to accompany him to all of these ridiculous parties. Not that society wasn't important, but it did sometimes lack a certain amount of stimulation. Chit-chat tended to be boring and rather superficial. Either it was that or all business. Hans had been a rather successful businessman at one time, but he had ended up spending the majority of his family's fortune investing in an extremely unsuccessful antique store in Hogsmeade, and it turned out he had no knack at all for pricing valuable antiques.
Yeah. Okay, that's how he lost his fortune? An antique store in Hogsmeade?
Yep. At any rate, his family fortune was dwindling, and his only hope was to get Melody tied to a very, very wealthy man and resume his usual business dealings, however unscrupulous they might be. Hans was no fool. He knew Melody's family was constantly in financial trouble, and that Melody probably had not kept most of the garments that he bought her in the past year, instead selling them to aid her family. If greed had motivated her enough to exploit Hans' hospitality, who was to say she wouldn't exploit the fortune of another man in wedlock?
First of all, it's not greed that's fueling her. It's the need to help her family and your supposed generosity of giving her gifts.
Yes.
She's not asking for these things, you're offering them to her, and she's just accepting them.
Yes. He needed to find her now, before September 1st rolled around, and to get everything set so that when Christmas holidays came, he'd have her, and he could wear down several potential candidates for his niece. But first he'd have to return to England, and that was a damned annoying task. He'd have to alert all of his friends, business partners, whatever you call them, as to his particular situation and tell them to keep a lookout for Melody. She'd met them all at one point or another, whether she'd realized this or not, and she'd had a very memorable face. People generally had very sharp memories when it came to beauty. But that wasn't important, really. What was important was this ruined his plans for the remainder of the summer, and he'd have to finish up everything in America very quickly, and that would be no easy task. The morning of the funeral dawned cold and dewy. Though a few other things happened that day, Lily would always remember it as the day of the funeral. It was the darkest day yet of Lily's young life. She sobbed through it, feeling with each wet, shaky breath she took that she was dying a little too. At the funeral home, she choked on the smell of chemical, badly cloaked by the scent of dozens of flower bouquets that had been sent. The caskets were open and Lily's emotions were raw. I've been to many funeral homes, but none of them have ever smelled like chemicals.
No.
She managed about 15 minutes at the luncheon afterwards before locking herself in the bathroom, throwing up, and collapsing against the wall, sobbing. She stayed locked in the bathroom until Melody found her and dragged her away from her solitude. Lily refused to sit at any of the tables except the one tucked in the farthest corner of the room, where James and Sirius and Melody kept awkward company until Mrs. Evans collected her daughters in the gathering darkness and took them all back to Potter's cottage. It was their home now, Lily reflected, as she stepped out of the fireplace. The wooden panels of the living room's strong oak ceiling loomed above her. The familiar furnishings of the room beckoned to her invitingly. James came out of the fireplace behind her and saw her looking around, a little bewildered, and caught her hand in his. She turned her head away from the furniture and looked into James's brown eyes. All of the things she'd for so long identified as James were now partly hers. Potter Cottage, however, for short a time, was going to be her home, and she found that with James's hand caught in hers, and tears still damp in her eyes, there was no other place in the world that felt as much like home. Home. Potter's Cottage was now home, and Lily liked that. It took several days for Lily to speak again. She hadn't wanted to speak, at least not to Melody or James or Sirius. But instead she spent a lot of time with her mother, talking and not talking, occasionally leaving the cottage to do muggle things like see movies or plays or what have you. Petunia joined them sometimes too, though she often preferred to spend her time alone or with her mother, but not with Lily. Petunia left very soon after the funeral to attend university, and after that things shifted a bit. Lily relaxed slightly. Things were beginning to mesh. Mrs. Potter would rise early and tend to the house, and Mrs. Evans was usually next to follow. Followed shortly by Lily. James and Sirius always rolled out of bed at the same time, usually around noon, and fought over the shower, even though there were dozens of other bathrooms in the house they could have used. Melody, who was a world-class sleeper, usually did not get up until mid-afternoon. Lily found herself with a lot of free time on her hands, and had taken to spending her morning hours walking around the indoor gardens, sometimes aerobically, sometimes just lazily, and simply thinking. She had too much to contemplate these days. Usually James, still in some form of pajamas, even after a brisk shower, would come to find her after walking with bleary eyes, and more often than not, a bit of toast in his hand. He and Lily would spend an hour walking, or kissing, or exchanging words, or a bit of all three before Sirius came in and interrupted them. Melody joined them in the late afternoon, and they all fell easily into this routine. This next part is just a whole bunch about Melody going shopping.
Yes.
I'm going to improvise a little bit here because we do need to start reading again at some point. I'm going to skip over a lot of nonsense.
Yep.
Melody eventually decided that she was over the routine and decided that they should all go dancing. The music was insane, the dancing was insane, the price was insane, but it was absolutely wonderful. James discovered that Lily could dance, and not just dance either, but dance.
Dance?
Maybe it was connected to her ridiculously fast reflexes, but that didn't make sense, as James's were just as good, The only bad thing about Lily being able to dance was the rest of the boys in the club wanted to dance with her. However, James, despite the fact that he felt kind of like an idiot next to the gorgeous and insanely talented Lily, did not intend to let any of the other boys dance with Lily. At one point in the night, this became a problem as Lily decided to step off the dance floor to get a drink, which James was extremely grateful for. At the bar, quite a few guys hit on her to James's extreme annoyance. Eventually, he resorted to snaking an arm around Lily's waist, which took Lily quite by surprise, but she didn't object at all. After that, the awful pickup lines were far and few between, but they did happen. Just before they returned to the dance floor, Lily, quite literally, ran into someone, of course.
Yep.
Looked up to apologize and promptly dropped her glass. "Ethan?" she blurted out in utter shock. Ethan looked at Lily and did a double take. "Lily?" They both looked at each other for a long moment, feeling confused, then stupid. "Oh," they both said. "That makes more sense now," Lily said, staring at Ethan, reflecting back on some of their conversations from earlier this summer. "Durmstrang?" "Hogwarts." "Yes," they both replied. James, who recognized Ethan as well from his brief visit to the coffee shop, was slowly but surely tightening his grip on Lily. "Why didn't you ever?" Lily began, and then stopped and shook her head. "That's a stupid question." "Do I know you from somewhere?" Ethan asked, looking at James curiously. James, who had been glaring at Ethan, or rather sulking, tried to change his expression quickly, but instead of looking relaxed, he ended up looking rather pained. "Oh, Ethan, this is James. James, this is..." "I know who he is," James muttered, shoving his hand in Ethan's general direction.
What a boy move.
Yep. Which Ethan briefly shook before turning his attention back to Lily. "Oh, Lily, would you like to..." "James, Lily, look who I found!" Sirius said, suddenly emerging from nowhere with a complete stranger in tow. At least for Lily, she was a complete stranger, but Sirius, James, and even Ethan all seemed to know her quite well. "There you are," Ethan exclaimed. "I was wondering where you'd gone." "Just off with my cousin," the girl replied, indicating to Sirius. "Hi, Andromeda," James said easily. "Wait, how do you know this bloke?" Sirius demanded, indicating to Ethan. "And hey, wait a minute, you look really familiar." "Ever been to a Muggle coffee shop outside of..." Ethan began, but Sirius cut him off. "Hey, I know you. You're the bloke who worked with Lily all summer." "It's a small world after all," Andromeda sang randomly in the background. "But how do you know each other?" Sirius demanded. "He's a member of my artist group," Andromeda explained, as though it would be obvious. "It was such a shame that he couldn't go around with us this summer, though. It would have been more fun if he hadn't been stuck in that bloody Muggle coffee shop all summer." Lily, who still hadn't been properly introduced, was slightly miffed that Andromeda would have any kind of opinion on the coffee shop when she'd never been there. "There's nothing wrong with the coffee shop," she informed Sirius's cousin rather indignantly. Andromeda laughed. "Except for the coffee machine," she replied, which only served to irritate Lily further. "Where's Melody?" Lily asked suddenly, hoping to distract James from his attempt to cut off the circulation to her waist. I'm right here," Melody cried, appearing suddenly behind Sirius. Melody was looking rather disheveled. Her cheeks were flushed, her dress was on slightly crooked, and her hair was falling rather artistically out of its clips. Only Melody could have managed to be disheveled and beautiful at the same time. "What?" Melody demanded when she saw the look Lily was giving her. "I was just dancing, Lily." Lily raised one eyebrow and Melody rolled her eyes. "Think what you want, but you ought to look at yourself in the mirror." Lily's hands immediately flew to her head and she attempted to smooth out her hair, although honestly it didn't seem to be all that messy. "Were you dancing with that crazy stalker type again?" Sirius demanded, although not in the same way James might have. Sirius and Melody were enjoying themselves thoroughly, both together and apart, and they had no qualms about switching partners in mid-song and often got separated on the dance floor. "He's not a stalker, Sirius, honestly," Melody said, rolling her eyes and fixing her top a bit. "He's got to be at least twice your age, Melody." Melody wiggled her eyebrows. "Twice that age, twice the experience." Lily was about to open her mouth to make a comment, but they were all interrupted by a tall, imposing wizard in a black suit. He looked vaguely like a security guard, and all of the teenagers froze. "Pardon me, but the owner of this establishment wishes to speak with you ladies." He indicated to Melody and Lily with subsequent nods of his head. Melody and Lily's eyes widened, and they looked at each other. "We didn't do it," they declared in unison, and the man chuckled. No, you misunderstand. You are not in trouble. He simply wishes to speak with you. Please follow me," he invited, and Melody and Lily shrugged and moved in the general direction the guard indicated. James and Sirius attempted to follow, but the guard stopped them. No, he said kindly but firmly, "just the ladies. Don't worry, they will be returned to you shortly," he assured them, and then ushered the girls off. Lily looked over her shoulder and shrugged at James helplessly as he watched her go. "Well, doesn't that just bite the big one?" James muttered bitterly as she walked off. "That's weird."
That is really weird.
Melody and Lily were escorted to the top floor of the nightclub and through a maze of security offices where some wizarding technology allowed a panel of security guards to monitor the dance floors. For there were multiple and bi-level ones, using something that very much looked like Muggle video cameras. Although that really wasn't possible, Lily imagined that they were operating several highly complex looking-glass charms, along with some invisibility and mobility spells. They passed through these security offices into a larger, emptier, more elegant room where one tall, imposing man sat in a tall, imposing chair behind a tall, imposing desk, and invited Lily and Melody to sit in the not-so-tall, not-so-imposing chairs on the other side of the aforementioned desk. He was bald, yet still sported a mustache, and had a look of elegant old man about him. When he spoke, it was with a French accent, and rather pleasant to listen to. "Would you care for anything?" he asked ever so politely. Melody and Lily looked at each other nervously, and shook their heads. "We're fine, thank you," Melody said. "Very well. Are you enjoying your evening?" "Oh, yes," Lily assured him. "The club is fantastic." He smiled. "Thank you. Now I must introduce myself before I become rude. My name is Philip Gerard. You may call me Monsieur Gerard. I am a businessman, gambler, and collector of fine jewelry. I am pleased to meet you this evening." Melody and Lily looked at each other, uncertain. Lily, despite Monsieur Gerard's pleasant demeanor, did not quite trust him, and so blurted out almost rudely, "I'm Lily. That's Melody. Pleased to make your acquaintance." Monsieur Gerard chuckled. "It is a pleasure, certainly. I can see you do not trust me, and that is all right. I simply wish to make an inquiry about your magnificent necklace," he said, glancing at Lily's neck. Lily, hoping fervently that he wasn't using this as an excuse to ogle at her breasts, felt her hand fly automatically to her neck where her L pendant hung on a simple golden chain. She hadn't removed it since the day James had given it to her, and had no desire to do so now. Plus, she didn't see what was so magnificent about it, and she wasn't about to take it off for some creepy nightclub owner. Melody's gaze slid back and forth curiously between the nightclub owner and Lily, but didn't voice any of her actual thoughts about the necklace's value. Instead, she began pulling things out of her ass. "I'm afraid you may be too late, Monsieur Gerard. If you intend to make an offer, it will be the third we've had this month." Lily had to restrain herself from shooting Melody an incredibly confused glance. Instead, she maintained her composure and continued Melody's bluff. "Not that I intend on selling it, Monsieur Gerard, but even if you did make an offer, I doubt it would be higher than the last. I've never heard of anyone offering such an exorbitant price for a necklace." Monsieur Gerard allowed his eyebrows to shoot up in a most undignified manner. "Do you mean that there are others aware of the necklace's value?" Melody rose one perfectly plucked eyebrow at him. "I should think anyone with half a brain and a decent education would be able to tell the value of this piece of jewelry," she said, wondering what the bloody hell Monsieur Gerard was talking about. "I think you may be surprised to learn that there are very few people who understand the significance of that trinket. Not that it is merely a trinket," he added hastily. "However, as long as you're aware of its value, I'd advise you not to sell it. There are those who would use it as more than just jewelry, if you understand my meaning." Of course, Monsieur Gerard," Lily agreed. "However, should you ever reconsider," Monsieur Gerard said, and pulled out a small white business card, which he sent to Lily on a magical floating coaster. Please contact me. Lily nodded and looked at him again, trying not to appear too befuddled. Now then, Monsieur Gerard, Melody said, attempting to take control as usual. Is there any particular reason you wished to see me? Monsieur Gerard smiled at her. No. Only so that your friend would not feel so out of place. Melody, who did not believe this for a second, nodded politely and smiled. Well, it was a pleasure to have met you, Monsieur. And you as well, ladies. It has been a privilege, he said, rising. Jacques will now escort you back to the dance floor. Enjoy the rest of your stay. There you are, James blurted, looking relieved and agitated at the same time. We have to go. It's almost 2. Lily's eyes widened, and she searched her wrist frantically for the time before she realized she wasn't wearing a watch. They arrived at 2:15 to find absolutely nobody waiting up for them, and they all looked at each other surprised and then shrugged. Well, I'm not tired, Melody declared. I don't know about the rest of you, but I want to do something. Me too, Lily agreed. There was a general murmur of consent from Sirius and James. I have some gobstones, James offered, but the other teenagers looked at him blankly. Never mind. We could play some limbo, Sirius suggested, and Melody glared at him. After a few more minutes of poor suggestions, back and forth, they all decided that they were going to make s'mores. Melody decided that she was going to go change, and Lily agreed and went to go with her. James, however, pulled her aside. What? Lily asked, surprised. Just come with me for a second, James said, leading her into the main hallway where all of the torches had been extinguished. He led her far enough so prying eyes could not see them, and then he turned to her, staring at her barely visible face in the darkness. James, what is this? If I didn't tell you how beautiful you looked tonight, I wanted to tell you now. In the complete darkness where you can't even see me? That's not why we're in complete dark, James replied. Oh, really? Then why are we... she began, but James cut her off. Lily hated being interrupted, but somehow she didn't mind as much when it was because James was kissing her. That's a good reason, she decided. Later on, Melody and Lily were telling James and Sirius about their strange meeting with Monsieur Gerard. The bulk of the conversation centered around Monsieur Gerard's interest in Lily's necklace, which none of them could figure out. I did get it from my mom, James said at one point, and she said it had belonged to my dad's mom, so maybe it's some kind of family heirloom thing. Since I am descended from Godric Gryffindor, it could just be something he owned. That doesn't make sense. If it was owned by Godric Gryffindor, it would have had to be over, Lily argued. 1,000 years old, James finished. I know, it's the only thing I can think of. It's just, it looks so new, Lily muttered. Maybe Professor Dumbledore will know, Melody suggested. It was a reasonable idea, but it didn't help any of them now, and it wasn't as though Professor Dumbledore was accessible at 3 a.m. during the holidays. Maybe your dad would know, James, Sirius suggested. That was also a reasonable idea, but as James's father was rarely home, it too was impractical. Also odd was the fact that Monsieur Gerard had requested Melody's presence. If the necklace was as valuable as he claimed it to be, why would he invite a third party to witness this conversation with Lily about it? There had to have been some reason besides the fact that Lily and Melody were friends, and then, of course, how had he even known that they were friends? It wasn't as though they had spent much time together on the dance floor. They'd simply entered together, but then perhaps that was enough. Who knew? At any rate, James, Sirius, Lily, and Melody had something to mull over as they curled up in their sleeping bags under the vast expanse of illusionary sky, surrendering their thoughts to nothingness and slipping silently into the realm of subconscious.
Okay, bye!
Bye! Thank you so much for joining us on our journey through the trapdoor.
You can leave us a review on Facebook or Apple Podcasts. It would literally mean the world to us.
Or you can find us on Twitter and Instagram at TheTrapdoor16.
Or if you have any longer thoughts, you can shoot us an email at throughthetrapdoor16@gmail.com.
Thank you so much, and we'll see you again next week.
See you next week.